Hi there, my name is Anthony Kent and I'm your main lecturer and the course coordinator for Strategic Urban Planning in second semester. And what I'd like to do today is obviously go through the first lecture. What I will do though is to do a bit of an experiment. So as you know, that the undergrad lecture is about 1.5 hours. So what I'm going to do with the first lecture today, and we'll keep trying this and I'll get some feedback on you, is to actually break the lecture into 3 sections. So each section will be approximately 40 to 45 minutes, which I've got an idea might actually be a bit easier to digest, seeing as we're doing this online. And even if we were doing it as a live lecture, then we would probably have a break in the middle anyway, so there's nothing all that unusual. But look, without any further ado, what I'll do is I'll try and bring up the appropriate screen. There it is. And I'll try and figure out how to go to the slideshow. Here we are. We'll do a click here and away we go. Now this is the first of the three parts of the first lecture. In total, will go for about 90 minutes. And I'll just bring myself down the bottom there. And in fact, I'll get rid of myself altogether because you know what I look like. Okay, now, obviously what we're doing in the first week is to look at an introductory approach to the course. And the first part of this lecture, the first third of this lecture, I do want to go through what I'm calling the nuts and bolts, which is really such things as the assessment, the structure of the course, what we do in tutes, what we do in lectures, and what sort of expectations, what you can expect in a kind of a structural sense from the course this semester. That's why I'm calling it the nuts and bolts. So, 3-part lecture. The first part will be, I'll briefly introduce myself. We'll be looking at the course and learning objectives, course overview. In the second part of the lecture 1, we'll be asking some more fundamental questions about what is planning and also what is strategy, and then what is strategic planning. We'll bring those two ideas together. Then in part 3, we actually go a bit intellectual and we start asking questions about theory, and we'll see how important it is to understand, to have a pretty good understanding, even at this early stage, of relationship between theory and practice and theory and strategic planning. We also ask another very fundamental question, which is, well, what is a city anyway, and what has strategic planning got to do with it? And then finally, at the end of part 3 of the first lecture, we'll talk about the tutorial groups, which will be meeting up on Wednesday. So the introductions, both Anthony, that's me, and Benno, together we've done a lot of teaching over a number of years at RMIT University in the planning department. That's me on holidays in Bali. That's Benno on holidays in his office downstairs. And we've worked together in various ways for quite a period of time, and we're both looking forward to working with you, and I think we're going to be able to have an experience which is actually quite enjoyable, not just educational, but something that you'll find a very stimulating subject. So indeed, welcome, and there's all the welcomes in all the world, and hopefully you can find, if you don't happen to have English as a first language, I'm sure you can find the welcome that's appropriate to you, or maybe one you've probably seen on a television show at one point or another, Aloha, for example. But yes, welcome to the course. So let's get into the course description. It will examine the principles, processes, issues, practices underlying strategic land use planning. And in a way, you could rephrase those words to talk about values, to talk about the way things are put in place, to talk about some of the things that raise their heads when we're dealing with strategic planning, a range of issues. And also that strategic planning operates at a number of different scales. It's not just a case of local government, although that's where you would find most strategic planners working, but there's a number of scales that strategic planning can apply. I mean, you could even say, when you think of an organisation like the United Nations, that there's even a global dimension to how strategic planning is put in place. So there's a number of geographical scales to which strategic planning applies. And there's a lot of issues that are unresolved or that are contested, and consequently we can talk about debates, but also we can talk about lessons, because strategic planning and strategic plans, particularly as we'll see in week 4, have been around for quite a while. And the idea, of course, is to actually learn from the past. And certainly our approach is, okay, sure, you've got the literature, but it's a very contemporary subject. Strategic planning is a very contemporary field. There's stuff going on all the time. So we'll be looking at examples that are happening on the ground right now, and we'll be bringing that into the tutorials. We'll be bringing news items, contemporary issues into the tutorials to inform our story in this course. We'll be looking at the role of strategic planners, and we'll be trying to get a good idea of what it is that they do exactly. What we will pick up pretty quickly, I think, is that strategic planners work within the confines of government. They work within the confines of overarching political ideologies and political frameworks. And it's inevitable that this shapes decision-making processes. So strategic planners have influence on the world, but it's also important to realise that they are confined by some of these overarching institutions and processes. And we'll be having a look at the main elements of strategic plans, and one strategic plan in particular, and that's Plan Melbourne. And we'll get an appreciation that what strategic planners are always interested in is this notion of integration. So in other words, there's no component of society that's really, or the economy, that's separate from the other. They influence each other. We've got to think of them in terms of interacting with each other. So it's transport, it's planning, it's social impacts and issues, it's economic, and it's environmental concerns. So there's multiple issues that are seen as interrelated when you're a strategic planner. But we will have a particular focus on one plan in particular. That's Plan Melbourne, and indeed that is what your main group project at the end of semester will be dealing with. And Plan Melbourne, as in the city of Melbourne, we can treat as a case study. So if you're not actually from Melbourne originally, well, that could be your philosophy. You could say, well, look, we're going to look at this place, Melbourne, which has some interesting characteristics. On the one hand, it's a city that on more than one occasion has won an award for the world's most livable city, but in other situations, and in the opinion of some people, that there's a number of issues that we're dealing with, that we're trying to manage in a place like Melbourne, and in some ways we're not dealing with them quite as well as we would think. You can think of environmental issues, you can think of employment outcomes, you can think of transport outcomes, housing costs. Although it is a pretty nice place to live overall, we're grappling with some quite complex issues. And here it is, Plan Melbourne, 2017 to 2050. And this is one of the two main documents that you'll be dealing with on a regular basis throughout this semester. And here are the contents, and these outcomes are actually very important, because they're very important in themselves, but for you folk, they're very important because your group essay at the end of semester is due at the end of semester. We will get you to actually choose two of these and examine them in detail and try to get an understanding of whether they're working, or whether they can work, or whether they can be improved. So of these 7 outcomes, then we'll get you to choose 2 of them, and in your group report examine them in detail. And you can see from these outcomes a couple of things. One is that they tend to be somewhat interrelated. They're not, you can sort of see there's crossover from one to the other to some extent, but also that they give you a lot to work on. There's a lot of material in here in these 7 outcomes, ranging from the idea of economic productivity to housing, to the idea of livability, to the idea of healthy neighbourhoods, resilient cities, and so on. Now, roughly speaking, not exactly, but roughly speaking, that the lecture program is a little bit along these themes as well. But we'll have a look at that in a moment. So let's talk about the course description. Finally, we have the focus on Plan Melbourne, and then the last point I want to make about the course description is one thing about strategic planning that's important is that it's trying to deal with what's known as positive and negative externalities. And I want to just pinpoint this for a moment and dwell on it, because it's quite important, even at this early stage, to get a sense of what we mean by positive and negative externalities, because this is really how planning was born, to deal with these two issues. So let's just dwell on this idea for a moment. So externalities, an externality is a cost or a benefit caused by a producer that is not financially incurred or received by that producer. So in other words, the producer doesn't pay for it, but we don't pay for it either. And that's why they call it an externality. It sits outside of the marketplace, but it can be good and it could be not so good. And it can stem from production or consumption of a good or service. And it could be in the private realm, or it could be at a broader realm. It could be at the community level. And often this idea of externality is linked with the idea of market failure. So in other words, the market is not successful in allocating goods efficiently. It might be oversupply, it might be undersupply, it might be a very nasty externality, and I'll show you an example of that in a moment, and you can think through some other notions about this. And the market, along with government and along with the people, is one of those entities that strategic planners are coming across regularly. So externalities, we have positive externalities. So you may be walking past some parkland and you're enjoying the positive externality of it, even though you don't actually have to pay for it. If you're walking past somebody's nice garden, it's fresh flowers and so on, you're enjoying the positive externality of it, even though you're not actually paying for it. And it's the fact that you're not paying for it that constitutes the idea that's an externality. And you can see how a strategic planner might be trying to actually encourage these positive externalities. But then again, I think I don't know about you, I'm not really a fan of karaoke, but if I was living next door to a house where karaoke was going all night, what I would be experiencing is a negative externality, unless in the unlikely event that the people running that karaoke party would come over to my house and actually pay me some sort of compensation to endure the karaoke noise that's coming across. But normally speaking, that would not be the case. Now, you can think more broadly in terms of what is a positive externality, what is a negative externality. I think one really obvious negative externality that we're grappling with a lot, and which sometimes it is, but sometimes it isn't paid for, and that would be the pollution of industry. And just having a look at land use to get a better understanding of this important issue. This is an example of land use market failure because it's disordered and it doesn't provide an optimum result for the people who live there, and it doesn't provide an optimum result for the people living around it either. But let's say a strategic planner will come in and look at this mess, this jumble, this disordered jumble of housing, and they would provide some order. They would provide some order, and not only that, will give us the opportunity to gain a positive externality. That is, with the order there, we can actually fit a park in the middle of that jumble. Okay, so let's have a look at the course objectives. It's important that to understand that strategic planning in your first year, along with the history of planning, this is providing the framework or providing the foundations for the rest of your degree. So we want to become familiar with some important contemporary strategic planning issues and principles. And okay, there is a focus on Melbourne. There's a broader focus on Victoria, but we will be bringing in examples from Australia. We will be bringing in examples from other countries. And undoubtedly, if there are some of you, I know there's some of you who actually are not from Australia originally, or perhaps aren't even in Australia right at this moment, then your contribution is welcome. We're very interested in making a bit of a comparative analysis when we can, because strategic planning is different depending on the location. We will appreciate ideas and debates that inform strategic planning processes at different scales, at the different geographical scales. And strategic planning is about ideas. They're not set in stone. They're ideas that are debated. They're ideas that change. They're ideas that evolve. And what motors that process are the debates. And you'll see in this course that a lot of stuff is not settled. There's two sides of the arguments, and there's a lot of folk who are still debating, putting forward ideas, putting forward data to justify this course or that course. You'll be introduced to the work of strategic planners, and you will get a good understanding of how to develop solutions, because strategic planning, there's a couple of sides to it. Yes, it is about identifying problems, but it's a problem-solving exercise as well. It attempts to move forward and make things better. And certainly, as I'll go through the lecture outline in a moment, in the last 2 weeks, we get to meet practicing strategic planners who'll come in and talk to us about their work. And as I've intimated, I think this is a good foundation for you moving forward. In second and third year, you turn to statutory planning, and we'll get an understanding in this course what the relationship is between strategic planning and statutory planning. They're different, but they're related. They have a close relationship with each other, but they serve different purposes or have different emphases. And actually in fourth year, you come back to another strategic planning subject. Let's talk about the learning objectives. Now, we want you to think. We want you to provide informed opinions. This is not really the sort of course where it's about rote learning, where it's about memorising zones or memorising regulations. It's more of a critical course than that, and that's because strategic planning is a critical kind of thinking profession. Discern the value of information and knowledge from a wide variety of sources and experiences. Now, it's inevitable that we're going to be coming across a wide variety of experiences, and that's because we're dealing with people, and people have themselves a wide variety of experiences. But it's a forward-looking profession. It's a forward-looking discipline, is strategic planning. It's about positive contributions. It's about making a difference across the community. It's about doing good, if I can put it in those terms. So it's not a twiddling your thumbs and being anxious kind of a field. It's about trying to find solutions, but certainly by engaging with the community. That's very important. Hence these kinds of important words: empathy, equity, shared understanding, always with a cognizance of the fact that communities are diverse, that people and groups in a community like Melbourne, like elsewhere, have a range of different perspectives, have a range of different interests. And this is one of the things that makes the role of the strategic planner interesting, because they are engaging with these different worldviews. And And here we have the actual lecture schedule. And you'll see in the first half mostly, the scenario will be that I will be delivering most of these lectures, and for the lectures I deliver, they'll be pre-recorded. After the break, we begin to specialise on particular areas, and appropriately enough, I'll be bringing in specialists. I'll be bringing in guest lecturers, people who know a lot about healthy cities, who know a lot about peri-urban issues, who know a lot about population. Some of these folk are researchers and teachers from RMIT. Others are actually workers in government. And the last two lectures will actually be bringing in some strategic planners themselves from local and state government. So the first half of the course is foundational material. The second half of the course begins to look at more specialised areas, culminating in what I hope you'll find an interesting interaction between yourselves and strategic planners at the local and state government levels. So the lectures, the point of the lectures is to provide the main themes and to provide some of the overarching approaches, as you've seen from that ladder that I just showed you. As I said, my lectures will be mostly pre-recorded, with the other guest lecturers, with the exception of the two final lectures with the strategic planners, and I would really want them to actually appear live so you can feed them with questions. I'll give them the options. The other guest lecturers, they may want to pre-record them, they may want to come in live, but I will give them that option. And I will continue the practice of breaking up the lectures into 2 and 3 sections for my own lectures, and we'll see how that goes. We'll have a bit of a review of it 2 or 3 weeks in to see if you find that a good way of organising things. The thing to keep in mind is that usually when we're in the real university, when we're actually face-to-face, you would find the recordings under Eco 360 because they've actually been recorded in the lecture theatre. Well, obviously we can't go to the lecture theatre for the time being, so therefore the recording will appear as a link underneath the module. So don't look for the lectures in Eco 360, look for the recording of the lecture, which of course you would have found it, right? Otherwise you would be listening to this lecture. It's under the module 1. Anyway, how can I rephrase that in a logical way? Okay, you obviously worked out where this lecture is. Well, all the other lectures will also be under the module. It'll be really obvious. So you'll have a recording of the lecture, and just above it, I'll actually have just the PowerPoint slides if you wanted to just use the PowerPoint slides for your own research. What I will do is to attempt to get these lectures up on the canvas several days in advance of the Wednesday, which is the official, the supposedly official date that the lecture is supposed to occur, but it'll be well in advance. I mean, for example, I'm recording this lecture today is Friday, about 10 o'clock at night. I'll continue recording it probably tomorrow night, Saturday. So by Saturday evening or Sunday morning, these lectures will be available for you. What I'll do is I'll put out an announcement. I'll say, look, the lecture's been recorded, it's available for you to listen to. And as I said, the definite exceptions will be the planning practitioners, because in past years, the students have been very interested in asking them a whole stack of questions, but some of those questions in fact relate to what about this, what about that, what is it like being a strategic planner, tell me about your everyday. So in other words, almost career development questions. Students are often interested in that, so that's why it's important, I think, to have an interactive process happening there. And the tutorials, yes, they won't be pre-recorded, they will be live. Now we'll connect to the lectures because we'll be raising questions, and me and Benno will be asking you questions about the lecture. And in fact, that will form part of your assessment for your tutorial participation, and I'll provide you some more detail on that in a moment. The readings, the focus will be on the readings that are already on Canvas, and again, part of your task, part of your assessment is to do some group work reading reflections each week, and I'll talk to that in a moment. But we'll be bringing in some other stuff as well. We'll be bringing in some news items and having a talk about those every week, I hope, because usually every single week something is coming up about the management of cities, and therefore the question of strategic planning becomes embroiled in that. And then another part of the tutorial would be the idea of having one or two exercises that will be based on the topic for the week. And what we'll do in that scenario is we'll be utilising the breakout groups, and we'll be discussing in the breakout groups and then reporting back. Now, the last two tutorials, I should point out, will be devoted to the presentations of your group work. So in other words, the last two tutes are presentations of the group work that allows you to iron out any issues and to get feedback from me and Benno on your final group work presentation, your final group work report at the end of semester. So let's have a close look. This is what I know you're interested in, is the assessment tasks, and we'd like to think that we've got a reasonable balance here. Firstly, you have the participation, the tutorial participation, a total of 20%, two components, the tutorial participation, I'll talk about that in a moment, which is 10%, and the reading reflections, which is 10%. The reading reflections will be a group presentation of 3 people or thereabouts, 2, 3, 4 people, usually about 3 people. Each week, a different group will reflect on the reading, and they'll do a very brief, straightforward PowerPoint to talk to us about the readings. More of that in a moment. Essay 1,200 words, 30%. Final group report, 3,000 words, a total of 50%, although there's a few little moving parts in there, which I'll talk to you about. So participation, a total of 20%. Tute participation, the usual generic stuff, judged on your engagement with tutorial discussions. You're used to this from first semester. You know what's expected. I don't need to repeat what you know already. There's the obvious things showing up, making a contribution. And the more you do that, the more contribution you make, then look, it's pretty straightforward. The better your mark will be. But let's talk about it in a little bit more detail, because often these tutorial participation requirements are all a bit general, and certainly the feedback I've had in the past from students is they'd like something a bit more specific. So let's do something a bit more specific, and we'll be really clear about it. You'll get 1 mark for logging on and to stay logged on for the entirety of the tutorial. So in other words, not just log on and 5 minutes later go. We want you to stay logged on, and hopefully you are actually sitting there in front of the computer. You haven't actually logged on and gone off and rode your bicycle somewhere. Now, just in case you did have that in mind, well, look, there is one other component of the assessment. So you'll get 1 mark for answering a question asked of you by me or Benno from a reading or from the lecture material, and we'll be actually going around the class. Now, we think that's important. It's not just to make your life painful. We think that it's a good technique in the somewhat unusual, to say the least, environment that we're dealing with at the moment. We don't have face-to-face classes, we're online, and what we want to avoid is a sense that people feel left out, that they feel that they're sitting there in cyberspace and not participating. Well, we're going to make sure that you can participate by putting you on the spot. So we will be asking you questions about the readings. We will be asking you questions about the lecture. So, for example, if you provide a comment of your own volition, well, you're off the hook. You won't be asked by the tutor because you've already shown that you've participated. That's the way that it would work. And then the logic of it, how we work it out, it's 10% for this component of the tutorial activity. And then obviously at the end of semester, we'll work out the grades, you know, the pro rata calculation, and you end up with a grade out of 10. So that's 10%, that's half of it. The second half is the reading reflections. We're beginning early. We're beginning in week 2, and you folk, we're doing it in week 2. I'll contact you soon so that to remind you, so you're up to speed, know that you're actually going to do it. Weeks 2 to 10, only. Like I said, the last 2 weeks will be devoted to the presentations for the group work. Now, what we'd like you to do, not what you have to do, I'm afraid, is that groups of 3 students will prepare, a straightforward PowerPoint presentation, nothing unbelievably elaborate, nothing unbelievably complicated, something fairly straightforward. I put here 4 or 5 slides. You might want to go up a few more. You won't be kicked out of class, metaphorically speaking, if you go up to about 8. Use your judgment. But the time is important. We don't want it to take up the whole of the tutorial. We certainly are interested in to hear what you have to say. So we're angling at about an 8-minute presentation and presenting your tutorial, of course, the week the reading was assigned. Now, when you do the PowerPoint, we'd like you to forward it to us before the tutorial. That's so we can load it up. So we can load it up on Collaborate Ultra so that there's no drama about technical issues or what have you, and we're ready to rock and roll the moment the tutorial begins. Now, the question is, who will be in what groups? Well, look, to be honest, I don't think it really makes any difference whether you choose your best friend or whether it's somebody random in terms of the quality and in terms of the learning experience. So just to make life easier for everyone, the groups will actually be decided by your tutor. The readings that you will do, probably randomly, the readings that you will do will be decided by your tutor, probably randomly. And look, there's nothing about a particular week that's seriously complex that would be unfair. I mean, it doesn't matter what week you're going to do it. It's all important, but more social science-based literature. There's nothing really complicated. You don't have to be a mathematical whiz or whatever to deal with the reading. So look, it doesn't really matter what week you're if you're concerned about not understanding a particular topic. That's going to be very unlikely. And of course, the logic of it. All students in the group will receive the same grade. Now, I do want to dwell on this just so you're clear on what it means. And look, in a way, we're trying to make life fairly easy for you. So we've got some guidelines on how these reading reflections will take place. And I'll email these to the people doing the reflections as well. So your reflection must at least answer the following 4 questions. You can go further if you like, but certainly these 4 questions are what we want you to answer. So the major issue that the reader is emphasising. There's probably one significant point you're trying to make. If it's a good chapter, if it's a good article, there should be, but maybe there's 2. You can say, okay, tell us 2. So that's one thing, but what resonates with you? What do you think was the most important thing to emerge from it? They may not be the same thing, by the way. You might think, well, look, this is what really resonated with me. So let's hear about it. Now, it would be very surprising if every single thing you read this semester is absolutely crystal clear, necessarily. Some things are written a bit better than others. So, okay, there might be some material you think is contradictory, confusing, or you think is just plain wrong. Well, that's okay. We actually want to hear about that. You don't say it's wrong because you don't like the feel of it. We want you to be academic about it and say, well, look, this doesn't agree with something else that I've read recently or something else that I've seen in the newspaper. But, coming forward and saying, look, I don't get this particular section, what they're trying to say, well, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm quite happy for you to do that. I mean, me and Benno have that experience all the time with some of the academic material we read as well. So there's nothing unusual about it. Now, having said that, I certainly don't want to give you the impression that we've got a barrage of complicated, confusing readings. We haven't. They're all fairly straightforward. All I'm saying is that if there's something in there that you find disagreeable for one reason or another, then we actually want you to be explicit about it. But on the other hand, what is the rest of the class doing while all this is going on? Well, we want you to think up 2 questions to discuss with the tutorial. So there's really 2 sides to this skill we'd like you to develop. Sure, one is the presentation, but 2 is to lead the tutorial discussion. And in a sense, well, by lead, What we mean is you hand it over to the tute to say, well, what do you think about this? So we'd like you to think of 2 questions to discuss for the tutorial. They can come straight from the reading, such as Smith argues that the urban growth boundary has increased by 5 kilometres a second, or what have you. What do you think? Or alternatively, it could be a topic related to the reading, not exactly directly from the reading, but a topic related to the reading. That's fine. That's up to you, your discretion. Make sure that the questions can be answered. That might sound like a strange thing to say. You'd be surprised. Questions can't be so complicated, can't be so obscure that it's impossible to answer them. So in other words, ask yourselves, when you make up these questions, can I answer it? Would I be able to answer it? So if you can answer it, then the people of the tutorial would be able to answer it. Now, part of that equation is that with your 2 questions, it can be on the morning of the tute, but the night before would be even better if you can actually email me and Benno your questions. Now, the one reason we want to do that also is that we will actually put it into our PowerPoint slide. And that's important because when you think about it, if you're asking people a couple of questions, if you really want them to understand the questions, then they need to have them in front of us. And of course, don't forget to state the title and the paper or the chapter and the author's names in your presentation. The first and only, in fact, individual work that you'll be doing, apart from the tutorial participation part 1, is the essay. Now that's due on Friday, the 21st of August, which is the end of week 4. I'm sorry, the end of week 5. 30%, 1,200 words. And by that time, you will be able to answer the following question. What is strategic urban planning and why is it so important in ensuring that our cities are well placed to meet current and future challenges? Now, by the end of week 4, in fact, not just week 5, but week 4, you'll have a pretty good idea. You have quite a few ideas in your head about how to answer this particular question. And yeah, look, it's the standard essay approach with a structure, with references. And we want you to engage with, although the essay is due at the end of week 5, we're only concerned with you focusing on the first 4 weeks of the readings. It's the first 4 weeks of the readings that will give you the information to answer this and to discuss and to analyse in this particular essay. And we want the guts of the reference list to be academic references. Now, what that means is that they're from journals or they're from a book chapter. And I don't mean a work of fiction, I mean an academic book chapter. And the reason for that is to avoid a situation where you've got a whole string of references where the majority of them, or almost all of them, might be from newspaper reports. That doesn't mean you can't use newspaper reports, but we want to encourage your research skills. And what that means is we need a critical mass of academic references. So we've got this figure we'd like you to comply with, 5 academic references. So for a book chapter, academic book chapter, or a journal article. And at the end of the semester, we have the strategic planning report, I guess the most significant chunk of assessment, well, without a doubt, the most significant piece of assessment for the semester, because in total, it's worth 50%. Now, again, it will involve group work. We will form these groups early in the piece in week 4, and you'll work in groups of 3 to 4. Now, there's 3 components of it. Firstly, as I said, the last 2 tutorials, you'll do a presentation that's worth 5%, and you'll get feedback on the presentation to help you polish up the final report. The report itself is worth 40%, that's due 23rd of October. The peer assessment, which is individual work, is worth 5%, that's due 26th of October. So in other words, this is a professional assessment of your colleagues' work and performance during the group report. Now let's focus on this a little bit more. Now, as I said at the start, basically the strategic planning report is about taking apart Plan Melbourne, and we'd like you to choose two of these outcomes or objectives to consider them and to analyse them. Now, as I said, you can see that they're certainly interrelated to some extent, and they're sort of distinct to some extent as well. And look, you can choose whatever you like, whatever you think is of most interest to you or that is most important. So let's talk about this a little bit more. I think what I've tried to do here is to highlight some of the key words. I won't read out the whole thing, but to give you a sense that we do want you to think. We do want your opinions, your informed opinions. This isn't about rote learning. It's about being critical. It's about basing being critical on evidence and research, on thinking through the issues. And it's about providing a good structure, a tidy structure, introduction, body, conclusion, the reference list is all okay. You need to show us that you understand the key arguments that you are presenting. That's important. And it is about your own research, of course. And all the bells and whistles. So we want the references all right and the references all okay as well. Now, this is the other key text that we're involved with here. Apart from Plan Melbourne, there's Planning Melbourne, and the book, quite recent, quite new, by Buxton, Goodman, Maloney. They're all teachers here, or Buxton was in the RMIT School of Planning here. And this, in many ways, is, I suppose it's an overused term, but I'll use it anyway. It's kind of the Bible about understanding the major planning issues facing Melbourne. It's well written, it's readable, it's interesting, it's got some very useful stuff in it. And a lot of the material, a lot of the readings you'll find for each week will actually come from this publication. You don't have to actually buy a physical copy. It is available on Canvas at the touch of a keyboard. Okay, so that's the first part one of the first lecture. And okay, what we'll do now is we'll have a metaphorical break, or a literal break, literally a break, and we'll come back and talk about part two, which starts to consider the questions of what do we mean by urban planning, by strategy, and, well, strategic urban planning as well. So, thank you very much, and we'll come to part two shortly. Well, hi everyone, and welcome to part two of week one's lecture. And in this section, we'll be talking about the guts of what we're going to understand this semester. Introduction to Strategic Urban Planning Part 2, and we're going to be asking the questions, what is planning and what is strategy? So firstly, let's ask the absolutely most fundamental question of all. What is urban planning? You've already been exposed to some pretty good teaching about how we got to where we are in terms of the history of urban planning, but let's reconsider it with a bit more of a strategic urban planning contemporary bent. So let's ask, what is planning? Well, it's all about the future. It's very much all about the future, the process of making decisions to guide future action. So what we're trying to do is to achieve something at a future point in time. And when you come to think about it, that doesn't just refer to urban planning. It's the same with any plan we might think about in our personal lives, thinking about our future careers, thinking about what we might do on the weekend. Human beings are all about planning. It's one thing that really distinguishes us from, well, most of the time, most other animals, most other creatures in the animal kingdom. But also it's an ongoing process, and it changes. We modify the plan, we look at it again, so it's not static. So as we move forward in time, quite often the plan that we started off with originally might change in the face of different circumstances, in the face of different evidence, in the face of new constraints, or conversely, even in the face of new liberation. In other words, we didn't feel, or we weren't as constrained as we thought that we were before. But what specifically is urban planning? Not just planning, but urban planning. What do we mean by that? Well, it certainly is about space, and it certainly is about land, the very land that we're walking on, the very environment that we're in when we walk around a city. And it's about managing it. It's about ensuring that it's distributed equitably and efficiently and in an environmentally sane way and sound way, and an environmentally sane way as well. So it is certainly about management, but it's about management of space, and it's about management of land. So you can see very quickly just how fundamental a role urban planning plays in not only our day-to-day existence, but our lives going over a number of years. So certainly it's a temporal thing as well. It's an exercise that carries on over a long period of time, and certainly, as you could well be aware, that decisions made, urban planning decisions that have been made in the past, this is what we've got today, and decisions that we make in the present are going to be around with us for a very long time. So it's important to try and get this phenomenon of urban planning right. It's also about guiding development investment and protecting the values of urban characteristics. Now, perhaps another way of putting that is it's about guiding the market, because the market is where we have supply and demand, where things are bought and sold. But one role of urban planning is to guide that process, to try to ensure that it doesn't get out of hand. In other words, to get back to that idea we spoke about in the first part of the lecture of encouraging positive externalities and protecting values of urban characteristics comes under that, but also trying to minimise negative externalities. It also sets frameworks and principles to guide the location and the nature of development, urban infrastructure such as roads and airports and sewerage and telecommunications. The principle that jobs, that transport, that education and services that we all rely on are actually accessible to us. So it's not just about doing stuff in a void. It tries to write down, it tries to document, it tries to put into place policies and principles that anyone can read. Plan Melbourne, that's a framework, that's got a set of principles in it, anyone can read them. So it's not a spontaneous thing that we do out of the blue. It should be an ordered process. And very much so, and this is the history indeed of planning, is the ongoing dilemma that inevitably in a big city or even in quite a small township, we find that there's going to be different stuff going on. And those different activities are going on the land. And therefore we are talking about different land uses. Quite often they are potentially or actually in conflict. And you can think of the history of planning, that terrible conflict that we used to have in the early industrial era, where you had very polluting industries side by side with the locations where the people who worked in those industries actually lived. And one of the early tasks of planning was to try to separate out those incompatible land uses. But also it's a research kind of a role. So urban planners they're trying to understand trends, and then the other side of their task is actually as a mediator. So in other words, to negotiate outcomes, to negotiate successful outcomes. So for example, to try to figure out where a population would best be directed, a growing population, but also you're actually dealing with a range of citizens. So you actually have to, with different interests, as we touched on in the first part of the lecture, And one of the roles of urban planning and urban planners is to try to negotiate different interests, which to begin with quite often might seem incompatible, but that's one of the roles of urban planning, is to make them as compatible as possible, to make them as acceptable as possible to as many parties as possible. And it is important to understand that urban planning occurs at all scales, at all geographical scales. You could imagine really from the precinct level to the state level, to the suburban level, to the local government level, even right up to the metropolitan level and beyond. So really layer upon layer, layer within layer, urban planning is concerned with all these different types of geographical scales. And it's very much an issues profession. It's about a range of stuff that we have to deal with as human beings, virtually everything you can think of. Now look at all these important issues, and in many ways there's a bit of a correlation there with the contents of Plan Melbourne and what you'll be looking at when you complete your final project. This is really fundamental stuff about how human beings can operate in cities and in settlements more generally. Stuff about housing, about population, about transport, inequality, jobs, environment, climate change being an important, increasingly important part of that question, about growth and development so that we can actually feed ourselves through economic development and we can lay down the foundations for a prosperous future, or at least a future that avoids poverty, that avoids hardship. So you can see that in all of these ways, planning is indeed as much about people as it is about space. But there's certainly many different contexts for urban planning. The way that it's conducted and the sort of issues that it confronts is going to be very different depending on the location. It's going to be different even, say, Melbourne compared with Sydney. You could actually get it down to that kind of level. It'll be different for one country town in Victoria with another country town in Victoria. And even different parts of Melbourne, you could say, when you think of those, if you've been out to a location, let's say like Melton, or if you've been to a location like Moreland, it's apparent that these are two very different places. They have different sets of demographics, they have different types of jobs, they have different types of transport, they have different types of needs, they have different types of issues and problems. So urban planning is a very diverse profession. It's driven by the diversity of the particular location that you would like to focus on and also the scale that we'd like to focus on. But you're always interacting with the political system, and political systems can be very different as well. And just to give you just one example there, that Australian states, here in Australia, we actually have planning ministers. You'll see them on the news occasionally. The planning minister will come out, and Richard Wynne is the planning minister in Victoria. Well, you take a country which in many ways is compared with Australia as being similar to Australia, like Canada. Well, they don't actually have a planning minister. They don't have a planning minister at all. Instead of that, it's actually headed by a professional planner who's appointed by the government. And there's always some sort of overriding political agenda. Now, this is partly driven by the fact that politicians, every election time, they want to get elected. So they need to distinguish themselves from their opposition to some extent, or at least have a clear message, a clear ideology, which is another way of putting an overriding political agenda. And you see that this will change over time. It'll change over history. Immediately after the Depression in the 1930s and the Second World War, the overriding political agenda was reconstruction. Reconstruction in Australia, reconstruction in many of the ruined cities, the bombed out cities in Europe. In later years, let's say from the 1970s onwards, the overarching political agenda has tended to be privatisation. So in other words, those entities, those authorities, these kinds of authorities in Victoria, which many people have forgotten about, such as the State Electricity Commission, the Melbourne and Metropolitan Board of Works, the Gas and Fuel Corporation, all of these entities were government monopolies that have since been privatised from the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. So this is an overriding political agenda that planners need to contend with and work within, and also coinciding with that partly, but also in some ways being more predominant at some times than at others, is another political agenda, and that's the idea of sustainable development. In other words, not to abandon development, not to abandon economic growth, but to conduct it in a way where the damage to the environment is minimised. And a point that I've already emphasised, and I'll emphasise it again, which is that planners are working with communities. And because communities are different, that means they have different viewpoints that you need to take on board and work with. And also they have different levels of participation in decision-making processes. Now that's an added complication, that if you want to engage with the public, in many cases, for a variety of reasons, there's some sectors of society who are not very good at engaging in such things as meetings. It might be because they're not articulate, it might be because they have English as a second language, it might be because they have a disability, a whole range of things, which means that all participants are not created equal. And this is something that you need to consider when you're engaging with communities as a planner. And here's a question which is actually rather difficult for us to answer. The actual power of planners is somewhat ambiguous. And a point I've made already is that while we're making incredibly important decisions and dealing with incredibly important issues that influence the lives of people, we are also constrained by political systems. And this includes when we're trying to develop strategic plans. I've already touched on this idea that at various points in history, there's usually one dominant form of ideology that guides the way things are done. So, okay, planners kind of have this dual role. They are advisors to government in power, but it's the government who makes the decision. Now, look, the extent to which planners are powerful in this context boils down to the extent to which government listens to them. They can advise government, but they may not always be listened to. But if you have a period where the planners are particularly influential, then therefore their power is influential. So this is an interesting quote by Flyberg, where he says that planners will investigate a policy problem and they then inform the city council. So far so good, but ultimately it is the council, the local council, who would decide on the problem. So planners are not, strictly speaking, decision makers. They're the ones who provide advice to the decision makers. So indirectly it can be said that they can be quite influential. Let's turn now to an even more specific question, and what is strategic planning specifically? And here I'll introduce the relationship with its close cousin, which is statutory planning. And this Venn diagram, in other words, there is something of an interaction going on here, gives you schematically some idea of where these two similar sounding but nonetheless distinct streams of planning lie. Strategic planning is the formulation of controls on the use and development of land. So in other words, doing the background research to establish what the planning law might actually look like. And hence statutory planning is the administration of controls on the use and development of land. So one is working out what those administration and controls should be, and the other one is actually putting them into place. So you can see that they are indeed distinct, but there's obviously a very close relationship between the two. And probably a reasonable way of thinking about this without suggesting that one is more important than the other is that the role of the strategic planner and of strategic plans is to provide input to statutory planning. Statutory planning couldn't exist without strategic planning, but strategic planning actually wouldn't have much to do without statutory planning to actually administer the controls that are decided upon. So let's drag this out a little bit more to get it a bit clearer. So you could think of strategic planning as being the strategy, and here are some of the things that distinguish strategic planning from its close cousins to statutory planning: making the plans for long-term spatial decisions of a particular area. Big picture stuff. So they're talking about, they're involved in, they're incorporating, they're concerned with issues such as sustainable development, such as long-term employment outcomes, such as long-term decisions about important transport infrastructure. Big stuff that actually molds the shape of a city. They work out strategically about where things should go. So it's not just spontaneous, it's not just thinking this kind of land use should go here because we like the look of it. It actually involves a bit of background research. It involves some analysis of some data. It involves consultation with the community. And consequently, one of the roles inevitably is that the strategic planner is trying to balance different needs and objectives of members of the community. Statutory planning is based on strategic planning, the laws and regulations to implement the strategy. And consequently, typically, and this is what you'll see when you do strategic planning next year, statutory planning has a large part of its component, a large part of it is zoning, in other words, different types of land use. And you can think about applying for a planning or a building application, referral is made to the planning law. So in other words, most things that go on within a city are dependent on these laws and regulations, which are administered by statutory planning. But to get to that point in the first place, you have the research and the consultation and the examination of the data and some other things that is actually done by strategic planning. And this process is ongoing. It's not just static. The strategic planner doesn't just put their books away and go home. After they've provided this information, there'll be reviews of the law because things will change, the economy will change, the relationship with the rest of the world will change, things happen, stuff happens. And therefore we are always going back from statutory planning, back to strategic planning, and then feeding back into statutory planning again. It's not a static profession by any means. Now, for the strategic planner, these are the sort of critical questions that come up again and again. The first question is to ask of the community, of a city, well, what sort of a city are we? I mean, where are we now? Is it a manufacturing city? Is it a city with or local government area? Is it a city or a local government area that happens to have high unemployment, that has a high migrant population? What are the strengths? What are the weaknesses? What are the opportunities? What are the threats? That SWOT acronym is very useful when it comes to thinking about how strategic planners operate. And the next very important question is, okay, if we are here now, then well, what do we want to do in the future? Do we want to keep things basically the same? Are there certain things that we'd rather not have going forward? Are there certain things that we do that we're pretty good at, that we're pretty happy with, that we actually want to increase, that we actually want to strengthen? Or is it the case that we need to therefore think about, well, look, a new approach, a new way of doing things, a new form of land development, a new set of relationships? Now, having got to that point, the next question is, well, how do we get there? If we have a view that we've actually got an objective, we've got to sit down and think, well, what is the best way of getting there? That is the strategy. What is the strategy to get us from where we are now, which is A, to where we want to be, which is B? And research and advising takes up a lot of the time of the strategic planning to deal with those first three questions. But it can get very complex because there are competing needs, and quite often one of the role of the strategic planner is to make an informed but difficult decision about prioritising. So in other words, one need might be more important than another. In some circumstances, a state or a city or a local government area, the priority for environmental protection might take precedence over the priority for economic development or possibly vice versa. It just depends. It just depends on the first three questions that we try to deal with. And I guess another way of thinking about this is that strategic planning can be transformative. So in other words, it can say, okay, we're going to go forward from here. But it could also be responsive. In other words, it's trying to stop something bad from happening. And in a way, you could also use climate change as an example of both those two approaches. I mean, strategic planners, we use both at different times, but climate change, it could be about mitigation, in other words, stopping it, or it could be about adaptation, in other words, going with the flow, so to speak, and working with what you've got. So planning, strategic planning in particular, is pretty complex, but that is what makes it interesting. That's why it isn't all about predictability and rote learning. It involves the social and the political and the technical side of things. It asks questions about how our objectives prioritised, and they are not informed by these things quite often. These are the sort of objectives. When you're forming your objectives, these are the things that the strategic planner will typically take into account, will typically do on a day-to-day basis and in a longer-term basis. It is about research, so it is a kind of an intellectual or an academic exercise, different forms of data, knowledge, expertise. But it's not all about burying your head in research. It is also about community consultation. And related to that means it's also related to stakeholder engagement, business, other levels of government, minority groups, special groups, local members of the community, the local sports club, you name it. Anyone who lives in a city, potentially, or a settlement, a human settlement, is potentially a stakeholder with whom strategic planners regularly engage. And as I said, also that final point, that after all of this, inevitably, you'll become very aware, whether you like it or not, that there's going to be an overarching political agenda that will both guide and confine whatever it is that you're trying to achieve. Hi everyone, and this is the third part of the first lecture, and now we're going to turn to some somewhat more intellectual material, and we're actually going to walk into, right at this early stage, this question of theory and why it's so important for strategic planning. So that's both a fundamental and a complex question. What does theory have to do with this? But also another fundamental and complex question is, when we're talking about a city, what is it that we're really talking about? And it might sound like an unusual question, but we'll have a look at it anyway. So theory, you probably heard this word bandied around and people use it in everyday language. I have a theory that the garbage won't be collected this morning, or I have a theory that my team will win the premiership again this year. Well, look, people use the word theory in a lot of a general sense, but in the academic world and in the planning practitioner world, we use it in a slightly more, well, not slightly more, a particularly more precise manner. But it is important, it's very important, and let's get some understanding of why that is, why it is important. So probably a good way of dealing with a potentially complex idea or set of ideas is to look at some examples of theories. Let's consider some of these. One theory that is very prominent is this idea of structure, and it's the idea that we have an overarching set of values or institutions or laws or practices which guide us down to the grassroots level. So in other words, in a sense, you could imagine the analogies, you're looking up above and there's a structure above you and we're constrained by that structure. And usually this understanding, the understanding of structure, is that's often been in place many years before we arrive on the scene. So there's a lot of things that have gone on in the past that have put that structure together. Now the argument therefore would be, if you want to change what's happening down on the ground level where we are, then actually what you have to do is to change the structure. And this idea of structure that can actually appear across the spectrum of politics. So from the communist world of Marx, who believed in structure, that it was the means of production, and the class structure that determine stuff that goes on in the everyday sense on the ground, right across to the other side of the political spectrum of the notion of the market as being the overarching structure that determines the stuff that goes down at the grassroots level. And the opposite of structure is agency. So in other words, that rather than us being monopolised or manipulated by these overarching structures, which quite often are there perhaps centuries in some ways before we arrive on the scene, there's this idea of agency that we as individuals in our actions can actually determine our fate. We can actually determine history, we as individuals or we as communities. And there's a bit of an interplay between these two. You shouldn't get the impression that the two are completely separate. Structure will confine the extent of agency that we have, but the agency that we do have as human beings of our own volition will, in some ways incrementally, in other ways more radically, alter the structure. I'll give one example of how the structure of Marxism converted radically to the structure of neoliberalism through the work of agency, through the works of individuals. And that was in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union in the 1980s, where you had a whole heap of people using their agency, demonstrating and protesting and so on, and enough of it happened, the agency of those individuals, enough of that happened to actually make that structure change altogether. It's not that there was no structure. If there was no structure, there'd be anarchy. But one structure was replaced by another, but that was very much due to the fact that people use their own agency. So what you've got is a continuing interplay between the two: structure, agency, structure, agency. And another notion that you will come across in terms of theory is path dependency. Now, this is a curious idea. In some ways, it's kind of like structure in that there's a sense of inevitability about it. But the analogy is that the path is often quite broad. So in other words, we can exercise a fair bit of free will and wriggle room within the particular path that's accorded to us in our personal lives or accorded to our city or to our society. So in that respect, it kind of resembles structure in that it's predetermined, but path dependency isn't necessarily always a bad thing. I mean, it can be a bad thing because it can confine us, the alternatives we may have available when things go wrong. But on the other hand, if things are going well, I guess it's a question of if you're on a good thing, stick to it. So in other words, we might have certain skills, we might have certain values and attitudes. And by the way, when I say we, I don't just mean we as a collection of individuals, but quite often a particular community, a particular suburb, a particular city has a way of doing things that's actually pretty good, that they've done it for decades. They might be very efficient, they might be very caring, they might have a very broad skill base. Now, all of these things are kind of a set along the path, but that in those respects, in that example, path dependency can be a good thing. So when you hear the term path dependency, this is a theory, but it can have a good side and it can have a bad side. And another theory that you'll come across, communicative rationality. And Habermas is the key thinker here, and inevitably with these theories you tend to have key thinkers. And the basic notion here, the basic notion is a faith that in getting together and talking, we can actually work things out. Now, at one level that might sound, well, kind of logical and an everyday kind of thing, but when you think about it, it can be pretty complex. And certainly when you enter the world of strategic planners, it can become very complex. But what keeps people going, what keeps strategic planners going through all those long meetings, through all those arguments, through all those seemingly incompatible points of view from a range of people from a whole range of different backgrounds, is an underlying faith that we as human beings have the capacity to come to an agreement which may not be 100% satisfactory for everybody, but it is good enough. It's enough for us to come together and to make an agreement. Now, in a sense, the historical strength, the evidence of communicative rationality is democracy, is democratic societies. Because when you think about it, the divergent political viewpoints, there's plenty of them, and yet we still have this thing called democracy. Every 4 years we go, every 3 years we go to an election. So that's an example of communicative rationality in practice. But it's very important for the strategic planner precisely because of the need to engage with communities which have different viewpoints. And the underlying strength, the underlying motor that keeps this seemingly endless array of conflicts not from deterring us or discouraging us is the fact that there's a belief that in the end we will come to an agreement which everyone can live with. And one more, and in a sense, this is the counterpoint to communicative rationality. Now, the Habermasian approach would say, look, isn't this good that we've started off with divergent viewpoints, we've had a few meetings, and okay, we've reached an agreement that everyone can at least live with. Well, the other side to keep in mind is that things are not always as they seem. So just to give you one example, you might have a series of community representatives at a meeting, and those community representatives come to an agreement that they can all live with. Well, again, you've got this key author behind this notion of Foucault who would argue that, well, look, the problem is that these community representatives are just that. They're representatives. They don't necessarily reflect the views of everyone they're saying they're representing. They're just individuals at that meeting and they have the power. Now, the important component of this, however, is knowledge is power. So in other words, some people have access to information, others don't. And you could well imagine how certain members of society and certain members of the community are denied access to power because they don't have knowledge about things. And this is one reason why one of the roles of strategic planners is to convey information as clearly as possible. But it also makes us cognizant of the fact that some members of the community struggle to access knowledge for a variety of reasons. There are many people, members of the community, unlike us, who don't have a university education or haven't got to the point where they're at a university. And there's many members in the community, of course, who don't have English as a first language. And look, we're seeing this issue emerge in Melbourne right at this moment with the virus issues, that there's some ethnic communities where the government has quite foolishly not taken care to convey to these communities in their own language what the issues are with COVID-19 and what some of the restrictions are. So that's an example of knowledge being power, and there's many examples of that. And another theory that you'll come across, and you'll hear these expressions, modernism and postmodernism. Broadly speaking, the Habermasian approach would lie in the world of modernism. The idea, and this is speaking very broadly, and some Habermasian scholars might dispute this, but modernism has this idea that we are moving forward, that we're progressing, that we can work things out, that the economy will get better, that we'll have more free time, that technology will improve things. It has a faith in solving problems, quite often through technological means. So, for example, environmental calamities, environmental problems can be solved by technology, by solar panels, by electric vehicles. So a sense of moving forward, particularly from this emerging from about, I guess, the 16th or the 17th centuries, that period, what's known as it's not particularly modestly self-described as the Age of Enlightenment, when people moved out of an understanding of reality as determined by spirits, by gods, and instead saw reality as being very much influenced by facts and figures and rationalism. And we could work stuff out and we could move forward, and we continue to move forward into the future. The postmodernists have a different view, and they argue that things are relative. So what is progress for one person is going backwards for another. And the strength of postmodernism is that it takes account of the different viewpoints, the different worldviews of different communities. The criticism of modernism is that it has a tendency to generalise people. They speak of people in terms of citizens as some sort of abstract entity, or as a member of, let's say, the working class or the ruling class or the middle class, as if they're some sort of abstract entity. And postmodernism is much better at taking account of what the complexities of people, their ethnicity, their age, their gender, their sexual orientation, their politics. It's much better at doing that. Now, all of these ideas, all of these theories are, look, the curious thing about them is that they're not necessarily in conflict with each other. In some ways, they're complementary. And perhaps one way of viewing them is seeing them as a kind of a toolkit, which at one point or another, depending on the circumstances, are useful in moving forward the ideal of strategic planning. And for that matter, virtually any other academic pursuit as well. I mean, if you wanted to walk into any of the social science or humanities faculties in any university in Australia or the world, these sort of ideas would be living there as well, and they live in the world of strategic planning also. But if you want to turn more directly to the way that theory is applied to planning specifically, this author, Almendinger, and also Faludi have this notion. They argue that there are theories of planning. So why are we doing it? Why are we bothering with it? Why don't we just not plan anything? That kind of stuff. But also theories in planning. So in other words, with the assumption that yes, we do need to plan, we do need to go ahead. Let's say we've resolved that philosophical question, but theories in planning is how to go about it. And some will say, look, the government plans from the top, and you saw this in the Soviet societies, and you still see it in some countries where they have the big 5-year plan, and we're going to impose this, and we're going to have targets, and we're going to do this here and do that there. So they're imposing it from above. So that theory in planning is that the way to go about it is from big government, but others would say the exact opposite. They say, well, no. How to go about it? Well, one way to go about it is from the grassroots up. Let's say very small scale, even neighbourhood level communities would come together in what's known as community planning or participatory planning to do the planning from the bottom up. So their theories in planning. And as I said, that the different streams of theory often, live with each other to some extent, and they're not entirely mutually exclusive. The other character that is interacting with theory all the time is practice, which is a good thing for sure, because you won't want to just have theory without it ever coming into any sort of tangible form. Now, these two interact on each other. So there is a theory about how to do things. It's put into practice. It might be the case that, well, circumstances change and that practice is no longer practicable or might work out to be no good. And therefore we end up going back to theory, which is developed again, and then back to practice. So theory, practice, they're not separate. They're two entities that influence each other. And that's the point about theory as well. It might sound like some kind of almost, biblical, unstoppable, unmovable, unchangeable idea. Well, theory can actually change over time, and it is influenced by practice, the accumulation of experience through practice, and also the accumulation of knowledge from practitioners must feed back into theory and influence. Because if you don't, what you have is dogma. You have dogma. And there's actually very few entities in human societies where theory stands still. Very few, even in the world of, let's say religion, to give you one example. For those of you who practice religion, understand it, you would have seen that, look, over time and even today, there's certain debates and wriggle room about how the doctrine should be understood and elaborated. But usually theories don't just change overnight. They're not just here one day and gone the next. There tends to be a build-up of credibility for a new way of thinking and a decline or a deterioration of credibility for the old way of thinking. So therefore, they tend to occur in big chunks. So if you think, for example, leading up to the economic depression of the 1930s, there's no doubt that the key economic theory was neoliberalism style. It wasn't called neoliberalism then. It was neo being new. It was just called liberalism. So in other words, the market is pretty much unfettered. What the Depression showed was that the market is actually very poor in some circumstances at distributing resources and distributing jobs. We're asking ourselves the same questions right at the moment. Now, because of that, there was a new theory which came in, a new paradigm, which was Keynesianism, named after John Maynard Keynes. And his idea was that, look, the government must intervene in those points where the market fails. Where the market fails to provide jobs, the government comes in. Now, this is very good for planners, right? Keynesianism and planning tend to go together because planners like to come in and intervene and actually manage things to make it work better. So you have paradigm shifts, what's known as paradigm shifts, and what this cartoon I'm showing here is from Bugs Bunny. I believe that this character being portrayed here is Christopher Columbus, who was the discoverer of America, and the cartoon is conveying him going to the King of England, and Christopher Columbus is pointing at his head saying, "The earth is round like my head," and the king doesn't want to have a bar of it, and so he clocks him over the head to make his head flat, and the king then says that no, the earth is flat like your head. Now, believe it or not, and indeed in China, for example, right up until about the 17th century, people thought the earth was flat. Before that, going back past in history, they genuinely thought the earth was flat. And then accumulation of evidence, thanks to Socrates and a few other characters, we eventually got to the stage where we generally accept, I hope, that the earth is actually round. And planning theory can be applied across a variety of different types of planning. So with economic, and so you actually have theories within these particular sub-disciplines of planning. So for economic planning, there might be the notion that cities is about managing the economics of cities. I mean, that is basically what we understand as cities, as a kind of a economic engine. So the neoliberal approach is one characteristic of this, that cities operate according to market laws. Or you might have the Marxist view, which is that cities operate as sites for capital accumulation and class conflict. So in other words, it's a particular view of the city very much through an economic lens. But the physical development planners would have a different view. They would have more a notion, a theory about the city as being based on, well, effectively bricks and mortar, property rights, zoning, master plans. This is also understood in some quarters as physical determinism, the notion that if you change the physical form, you're actually going to change human behaviour as well and influence the economy directly. But a third variation is policy analysis and planning, the desire to have a more effective and efficient public administration based upon reason and scientific analysis in an attempt to depoliticise planning. So this is a notion of planning as being something that we can base it on rules, that we can be objective about it, and a very, I think, optimistic view that if you show these rules to a variety of people, they're all going to come to the same conclusion. They're all going to say, they're all going to be looking at the same thing as if it were the same thing. This translates into some big schools of thought in planning. Rational, comprehensive planning is very much, I guess you could say it was old school. It's one that's dominated thinking about planning for quite a while. It's the view of planning as a technical exercise, as something that is logical, very much living within that idea I spoke about just before of modernism, that we can make the assumption that we are moving forward, that we are progressing, and that we can actually put in place a plan that we can be confident that will ensure that this progress will occur. So it's rational, follows a logical, ordered sequence. Its other characteristic is that it likes to have it all. It likes to include every component of society, and consequently, it could be regarded as comprehensive because it canvasses and compares all of the options. And part of this equation of being comprehensive, of being rational, is to have specific steps, 6 basic steps. And you can see them here: defining the problem, values, goals, objectives, identifying all the options, determining the costs and benefits, comparing the costs and benefits, and selecting the course, which maximises the outline in line with the values, goals, and objectives. So it's a very coherent, comprehensive, ordered process, with lying behind it is a faith that, yes, it's all going to work out okay in the end. But really, its strength is also the basis of its criticism, the view that it tries to be too comprehensive, that it's too optimistic, that the things that are trying to be achieved will actually be achieved. And this rational comprehensive planning approach is also known as the systems approach in some quarters. Now, the criticism is basically that, look, you're trying to impose a well-ordered plan on an entity which isn't very well planned to begin with, or at least is particularly complex, and that is cities, that is urban societies. Now, one of the classic examples of this are the planned new cities, quite often the new capital cities that are planned in countries in the developing world. So in other words, they've had this problem with the old existing cities, which become very disorderly and have very poor infrastructure. And so they say, okay, we're going to start again. Now, Brasilia in Brazil is one example of this. They said, we're going to just start again. We're going to build, it's going to be perfectly planned. We'll bring in the professional planners. There'll be well-laid streets, everything, land use here, land use there. Everything looks fine. But what actually undermines that whole process is the fact that there was no account taken of the fact that, guess what? People will desire to orientate themselves to move towards that new city. And so therefore, in places such as Brasilia, what you find is a very well-ordered new city, but surrounding the city is a large array of informal settlements. People have actually followed the sun. Now, that wasn't part of the plan at all. The other thing that can be quite problematic in this well-ordered view is corruption. So in other words, in short, what's supposed to happen doesn't happen because somebody has provided somebody else with some money on the side. And related to that first point is the notion that human settlement is not always orderly. Development and urban development quite often just happens. And again, using the example from the developing world, you have a very large number of people for a number of reasons moving from rural areas to city areas very, very rapidly. And therefore, planning systems can't keep up with such a rapid movement of people to cities. So these are some of the criticisms that have been made of the rational comprehensive planning systems approach, which was really the main paradigm in planning application right up until about the 1960s. And the final criticism is again relating to the complexity of people. I mean, how can you be sure that you've identified all the issues and values? And well, the notion was that it was the planner. The planner decides the issues and values, and this had a somewhat authoritarian characteristic about it. I mean, the planner knows best. Well, the problem is that the planner, as an individual human being, have their own biases, and this notion of bias, that it would exist, or perspective, was not recognised in the rational comprehensive planning approach. The planner was seen as this objective entity without their own values and perspectives of things, rather than really just another human being who's dealing with other human beings who have different issues and different values to deal with. So you've got cities that are complex, and you have a range of issues here which the rational comprehensive approach didn't seem to be very adequate at dealing with. So cities were much more messy and complex than the rational comprehensive approach had assumed. And look, you've got social and environmental costs as well, which emerge, which are much more unpredictable. Environmental costs, for example, some of the impacts of them are short-term, some of the impacts of them are very long-term and are very unpredictable. Climate change being a good example of that. I mean, we've got a reasonable understanding that climate change involves the warming of the planet, but for different corners of the planet, that actual impact is going to be variable and at the moment is still unpredictable. Again, dealing with pandemics, we still don't really quite understand how the one we're dealing with at the moment is operating. There's a lot of uncertainty. And the rational comprehensive approach isn't very good at dealing with uncertainty. It doesn't allow you with much wriggle room. And you also have to consider the overarching political and ideological climate. Now, this might sound an odd question to ask. What is truth? And we take for granted the notion that we know the truth. Well, the problem is that what is true for one person is false or confusing or unresolved for another. Here's an example of how exactly the same idea can be interpreted completely differently. Now we have two individuals, they're both white Anglo-Saxon males, obviously, on the left, and they're both prime ministers of the country. Both prime ministers, they have the same job. On the left, we have Tony Abbott, who was the Conservative prime minister a few years ago, and his view on climate change was that it was absolute crap. That's what he said, I quote, "Climate change is absolute crap." The gentleman on the right is from Kevin Rudd from the Labor Party. He was prime minister a few years ago, and his view on climate change was that it was the great moral challenge of our generation. Now, there's an example of two individuals looking at exactly the same phenomenon, coming to completely opposite conclusions about what they are seeing. And I could spend the rest of the lecture, which you probably don't want me to do, giving you more examples of how two different people will look at the same thing and come to a different conclusion. So inevitably, when these paradigms come under attack, they become undermined. And I guess a good analogy is that the foundations begin to get washed away. It starts off with a bit of a trickle, and then more of it gets washed away, then more of it gets washed away, and eventually, metaphorically speaking, they collapse into the ocean. We're seeing a bit of that at the moment in New South Wales. So what emerged to become more of the central paradigm for planning, and this is the systems thinking approach. Systems thinking involving complexity, connectivity, and continuous review. So in other words, the key difference in this diagram compared to a similar diagram that you would have with rational comprehensive approach is that would have a linear movement, it would be a line from the past to the future and progress. But the systems approach is different. It's circular, it's feedback. It takes into account things along the way and reviews them and revises them. And therefore, what started off with a particular problem can actually mutate into a different type of problem, and it requires more review. So you have this circular process, new problem, information, decision, action, monitoring and evaluation, and then back to the problem again. So it's a continuous process. There's no sense of having reached a solution. It's a continuous process of review. And this gives you, obviously, much more wriggle room. It's not as dogmatic as a rational comprehensive approach. But another view, another take on the theory of cities, and this is the notion of the city as a money machine. And that might sound a bit, I guess, crude or extreme, but believe me, this is in many ways how urban development and urban management has come to be viewed. That, and another phrase you'll become familiar with if you aren't already, is the trickle-down effect. So in other words, allowing people to create wealth by facilitating the cities in order for them to create wealth. That is the basis of it. And from that, everything, other good things will flow. So the city is a money machine, as creating capital, as creating wealth, and politicians every day will talk about this. Another take on it is the city as a cultural melting pot. And again, this is, if the previous notion was perhaps more closely aligned, one would think, with the rational comprehensive approach, but also the neoliberal approach, and has remained prominent to this day. The second one is probably more attuned to the systems approach that takes more account of the different viewpoints and perspectives of individuals and communities and cultures. And therefore, the city isn't a money-making machine, it's a cultural melting pot. Now, what I mean by these overarching ideas is, in a sense, that they're the default position of how people, and including strategic planners, think about a city. That doesn't mean they have absolutely no interest in cities as about economic development or accumulating capital, but it's more a question of what is most important, what is the main value. How do we think about cities? When we think about a city, what do we think about it as? This is another perspective. The city as a cultural melting pot. And another view, again, is sustainable development. And there's been a series of ideas emerging in relation to this. And some of these terms, somewhat interchangeable, that you'll hear: smart growth, new urbanism, compact city, all have to do with sustainable development. And we'll be looking at some of these ideas this semester. Now, in practice, what that means is people asking questions about how the city is growing and how fast it's growing and in what manner. And you'll hear the term urban sprawl associated with these types of discussions. And therefore, the reaction to that is building in areas that are already established rather than building on the outskirts. Now, that leads also to the notion that, well, how do you do that? Well, you do it with mixed-use developments and mixed-up zoning, which is really overturning the basis of planning for decades, the idea that you have separate zoning for separate land uses. And therefore, there's a questioning of single function or single zone developments, a notion that it should be more compact, the notion that it should occur within the existing urban area, and the idea that zoning should be mixed up, so you'd have residential aligned with commercial, aligned with workplaces. And a related notion is resilience, the ability to take the knocks, to I guess, get knocked down and then get up again for a variety of reasons, how resilient you are in the face of shocks. And that very much depends on the strength of your capabilities to begin with. And because resilience, we're called on regularly to be resilient, then one of the key ideas emerging in strategic planning is to, I guess, stormproof your city or your community from the possibilities of dilemmas, from the possibilities of crises. And certainly the last, not just the last few months, but really the last 40 years or so, show that a series of dilemmas will come along, particularly economic dilemmas, economic recessions, and environmental challenges as well, that require cities and communities to have a degree of resilience. So it depends on the skill base. It depends on how good you are at organising communities. It depends on the sense of community spirit. And another term that's used closely in relation to resilience is that of social capital. So social capital not being money, but social capital really being the capacity of communities and individuals within those communities to do stuff successfully, to work together, to have skills, to think things through. And again, you can see the influence of Habermas here, communicative rationality, in that way of thinking. And a final one that I'd like you to consider, which is closely related to sustainable development, is the metabolism of cities. Let's have a look at this diagram to get a sense of what I mean by this. Now, this is becoming more to the fore recently in planning ideas, notions about post-growth or degrowth, which is really turning on its head the assumptions that we've had about cities for a long time, and it's certainly the antithesis of this view of the city as a capital growth machine. It's viewing the city as a kind of organic entity, almost as if it was a natural living creature, and involves, again, a paradigm shift from the view on the left, which is the normal situation, the normal state of affairs, where, for example, you'll see the recycling stream in the old way of doing things is actually pretty small. It's not very significant in that model. And also the resource throughput, in other words, the stuff that simply goes in one end and disappears out the other as waste, resulting in the other larger bar, which is the environmental damage flow, is much more significant in the model on the left compared with the model on the right. We have a much bigger recycling flow, you have a much less resource throughput flow, and you have much less environmental damage flow. Now, you could take that model on the right and sit down and develop a series of policies for your community to say, well, how do we go from the left to how do we go to the situation on the right? And this is the way that increasingly strategic planners are starting to think of in terms of the city, using this theory that we actually have a metabolism of cities and it can be of considerable value in developing policies. So, all right, we live in a bit of a changing, movable feast here to some extent in the world of strategic planning. Traditional, with the planners as the experts, with, if only by analogy, engineering solutions, a little bit like having a motor car that breaks down, you get the spanner out and you fix it, and then you can drive off again. And then you've got these particular methodologies, that's ways of doing things that are associated with this traditional view. Rigorous, so the notion that there is one answer and I can find it. Strong emphasis on the quantitative approach, in other words, numbers, mathematics, data, predictions, models. And as I said, it's technical. It's a bit like trying to fix, a city is like trying to fix a motor car. If something breaks down, you can actually come in with some tools and amend it. The shift, the paradigm shift, is based to a large extent on politics. The shift from the rational comprehensive approach to the more, I guess, flexible systems approach. There's a number of things that occurred, that particular time period where the paradigm shift set in, the 60s and the 70s, some political battles in the United States and elsewhere. And what this did was it undermined the role of the planner as a technical expert. And these photos here kind of sum it up in a way. I mean, you begin with Corbusier there in the top, who had this view that we could construct high-rise towers in a very ordered manner, and we could provide parkland around them. You have Moses, who wanted to reconstruct cities by demolishing large areas of the in urban neighbourhoods and replace them with freeways. You have Jane Jacobs, who challenged Moses and who eventually won. And in Australia, you have a gentleman here down the bottom, and no, he's not someone who's been caught sleeping on the street. He's actually a very famous trade unionist who's just died recently, called Jack Monday, who through his union, through his building union, the building union actually refused to demolish a parkland. It refused to demolish historic sites, and hence the Green Bans movement was born out of the actions of Jack Monday and his union, in coalition with middle class groups in Sydney and Melbourne, who actually agreed with what the trade unions were doing, which was to not work on these particular sites in order to maintain and improve the amenity of the city. So this involves some collaborative and consultative approaches to planning, and that makes it a bit different from the planner, top-down planner as expert. So the systems approach is more interested in these notions of community engagement and community process. So it's a bit messier, but if you have faith in the communicative rationality approach, things will ultimately work out in the end, at least in the sense that people will have a decision that they can live with. And therefore there's a recognition that we can't impose the one public good. There's actually several public goods because people in the community have different viewpoints. Consequently, you have a diversity of approaches. And therefore values emerge as important in strategic planning. It's not about facts and figures, it's more about what we think is the good city. And you can see some of these ideas: abolishing poverty, reducing crime, closing the gap. These aren't abstract technical ideas, they're values. They're values that we're trying to reach towards. And the method, though, is interesting. It's not a sort of a gung-ho approach at all. On the contrary, it's somewhat cautious. Even though these objectives are very noble, these objectives are very significant, the way of getting there is actually step by step, and sometimes taking 2 steps back and 1 step forward. And hence you'll hear these terms incrementalism, step by step, or even muddling through, which sounds like a negative term, but is actually saying, well, look, there's some complex processes going on. We have to be a little bit careful as we swim through this. So the progression of strategic planning and policy development in line with community political acceptance. And that's it. It's based on acceptability to the participants rather than the rationality of the plan. And finally, let's talk about Wednesday. Now, hopefully you're having a look at this lecture on today, which is Monday or Tuesday. You definitely need to look at the 3 parts. And here are our lectures. We have Anthony, we have Benno. They're all on the Wednesdays. We're running them on Collaborate Ultra. You would be familiar with this process from first semester. It's simply a matter of logging in at the appointed time and away we go. And well, that's the first lecture. We're looking forward to turning from the lecture into the tutorial sessions. Now next week, I guess I've tried this week to lay the foundations and introduce some thinking as well, some of the theoretical stuff. We're going to hone in a bit more closely on some of these challenges and issues that I've touched on this week. So we're going to have a really good look at this issue of population growth and urbanisation, climate change, sustainability, the natural environment, and look at strategic goals for planning. And we're going to ask some fundamental questions here. What kind of city do we want? And again, we've got some ideas, some adjectives about what a city is and what sort of city we want it to be. So we'll be asking some questions. Do we want a resilient city, and what does that mean? Do we want a sustainable city, a prosperous city, a livable city, a just city? And all of these are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Can we have it all? Can we have all of these things together? And there will be a focus on Melbourne in particular and the key issues and trends. So thank you for your attention, and I will see you in the tutorials.